They complement each other. Saudi Arabia does not have a military. Pakistan has a military. Pakistan does not have money. It is a famously poor country, horrifically poor country. Saudi Arabia has a ton of money.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray, in charge of podcasting, and with me as always is Robert. How are you this time?
Well, I'm just shocked. I'm trying to deal with this seismic, incredible geopolitical shift, Rory.
Why, what's happened now?
Have you heard of the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan?
This is monumental.
This is bigger.
Well, it's NATO. It's new NATO.
This is new NATO. This is bigger than Nixon going to China. This is a whole new world. BRICS is dominant. The tectonic plates are shift. Okay, I can't do that.
And if
anymore.
Israel fires anything near Saudi Arabia, Pakistan will nuke them. I'm certain that's what it means.
That's definitely what it means. The nuclear umbrella of Pakistan has been extended all the way across Saudi Arabia. Pakistan that couldn't get it together to honor an earlier agreement to give them 10,000 troops for cannon fodder in Yemen is gonna extend its nuclear umbrella. Okay, so
also, aren't their nukes famously small, as if to just be like, this is technically a nuke, please leave us alone?
Oh, man, yeah, the extent to which I've gotten very used to people overselling for very good reason.
Yeah, but the bricks, Rob, we're all getting BricsBox next week, and the dollar's in the bin.
Indeed. So yeah, as you've illustrated, like for very good reasons, because the United States, especially under Donald Trump, but also under Joe Biden, has been beyond alarming, has been utterly, there is what's the classic John Mulaney comedy bit?
This guy being the president, it's like there's a horse loose in a hospital.
The United States has been the horse in the hospital for coming up on a solid decade now. So it would make sense if everybody else in the world were making deals to try to get out from under U.S. control, to try to make deals to just defend themselves against the aggressive nightmare that the United States has become, with genocide in Gaza, trying to start World War III over Taiwan, whatever we're trying to do to Venezuela now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be natural, and I think there's a whole class of commentators, I think a lot of Europeans actually, who just sort of glom on to every new development and act as if it's like this tectonic plate shifting, the invention of spam. I don't know. Like it's like this whole new world. Everything that happens is a whole new world, and this is the day that the U.S. empire ended. And I get yearning for that. I do.
But Americans do like that this is the day the European Union ended.
Yes. That is also a malady. And of course, there's the whole YouTube channels that for 10 years now are China falls tomorrow. You know, the whole career.
Or China will destroy America tomorrow.
Yes. So that this is something that happens, but the sheer
things tend to be a lot slower and more boring.
Yeah. But the sheer absurdity, the sheer ignorance, the sheer just like idiocy it takes to look at a new agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and claim that it is something new.
Because they've never had an agreement before. They've never gotten along.
Yeah, just historic enemies. Yeah, I mean, the biggest example before this one was the Saudis and the Iranians invited China in to essentially, hold the box that they shook hands over a couple of years back. And that was everything's over for America. And it made absolutely no difference in Israel and Trump bombing Iran. Like it was utterly meaningless. And this too is utterly meaningless as far as constraining U.S. interests. And at least China and Iran were on the stage for that last ridiculous overselling of sort of BRICS futures. But like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, you are hard pressed to find two countries that are deeper in. Really, Israel is the only country other than Pakistan and Saudi Arabia that is more deeply dependent on the United States or more firmly on the side of the United States. There are some recent complications of that with Pakistan. China has been doing a ton to cultivate Pakistan.
But it is on its doorstep, so it makes absolute sense. And it's a
Yes.
counterbalance to India.
And Pakistan does have this interesting thing over the past decade or two where they are sort of trying to play both their patrons off of each other. But the extent to which the United States still has deep, deep connections to the Pakistani military leadership, and there's no other leadership of Pakistan, if we're being honest, other than the military leadership, is, enormous. So this idea that a relationship between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia is some kind of new thing that shifts things is absurd. But I think it's useful because it gives us an opportunity to talk about this relationship, which is a tremendously important relationship that has lasted the entire second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. It is possible, there is a world in which you could describe this as a renewal of Saudi-Pakistani relations, because there was a point in time when the United States was eager to put boots on the ground in the Middle East. Before that point in time, the Pakistanis had a ton of boots on the ground in Saudi Arabia to defend Saudi Arabia. They were briefly displaced by Americans, and now with this deal, presumably, they'll be coming back, if they aren't there already.
So about 20,000 in
Yes.
the 80s, was it? 1982?
So we're going to go all the way back, which is actually easier to do with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, because Saudi Arabia really only dates to the 1920s. I forget the exact year. And, despite the fevered arguments of many people who will tell me that Saudi Arabia goes back to the 1700s, and, it is a creation of the 1920s, Ibn Saud, the British Empire. Pakistan is also a creation of the British Empire in 1947. And really from the start, these countries had really obvious affinities. Pakistan was, I don't think this is very unfair to say, that Pakistan was closer in some ways to Britain than India was. I mean, leaving aside the fact that Nehru, the leader of India, was famously sleeping with the wife of the last viceroy, Mountbatten. The way that things worked in the falling apart of the British Raj was that, and this was, things oscillate back and forth. Britain was always using the Muslims against the Hindus and everybody else. That was something that they did. Up until 1857, that was something they focused on a lot. And then after 1857, they kind of turned on the Muslims, the First War of Indian Independence, for a long period of time until they created a very literate, educated class of both Muslims and Hindus, but more Hindus because they're just more Hindus in the Indian subcontinent. And then for the latter decades, into the 20s, 30s, 40s, as they were losing the whole subcontinent to Gandhi and his ilk, they switched back towards cultivating Muslim rulers, Muslim populations, and the Muslim minority was more open to that because they knew they were a minority and they could see. So Pakistan was built really around having deeper connections to an outside imperial power. This is not to minimize Pakistan's independence, its national vitality, this, that, and the other thing. I will absolutely be minimizing Saudi Arabia's independence, national vitality, what have you, in this. But I do not intend to do that to Pakistan in any way. I'm simply describing how Pakistan sort of came to be what it is. And I say that again as I've probably only read a dozen books on and around Pakistan, and that's nowhere near enough. So take that as a caveat. Initially, Pakistan had a much more competent military because it had there were more Muslim guys.
Inherited such a large military in the first place?
Well, there were just more Muslim guys who were closer to the imperial overlords in the military. And there's a lot of, still, I think, a lot of deep connections. What is the British military and Sandhurst and all that, frou-frou. This became a huge problem for Pakistan because it is sort of like Egypt, but I think probably even, is it more extreme? Or is Pakistan's military just more competent than the Egyptian military? But it is like Egypt. It is a country that is deeply, deeply run by the military. Pakistan makes more pretensions of real elections, has had popularly elected rulers, but they rarely last long. And
then they put Imran Khan in jail.
Yes. Well, Imran Khan is still alive in jail,
I think he's far too popular and famous to be executed.
Well, he may not be executed. They could just Mohammed Morsi him. They'll just keep him there and keep him on. Oh gosh, so sorry he died. He's old.
Oh yeah, but it would be mayhem if that happened.
Yeah, but the Pakistani military has absolutely executed
Oh yeah.
people in the past. So the British Empire, the main reason that the British Empire gave up on the India, Pakistan, Bangladesh in the 1940s is because they simply could not afford it any
yeah,
longer. And which was a little awkward for Pakistan because they were really well suited to having an outside sponsor. And the United States came rampaging in because at that point, there was only one country, poor Afghanistan, in between Pakistan and the Soviet Union.
It does seem like America does just sort of go, Britain, what colonies are you giving up? We'll take them.
I think that Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are among the largest examples of that. And the United States has outsized power. Like I joke, like the CIA is pretty incompetent outside of Latin America. The CIA can accomplish a lot in Latin America because in most Latin American countries, there's a very racist white oligarchy who really wants to work closely with the CIA. Like we have people who are 100% pro-capitalist, anti-working people just on the ground across Latin America to automatically work with. That's why the CIA has more success in Latin America than elsewhere. But Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are also places where there's just more of an inroad for us because Pakistan, we loved Pakistan because it was close to the Soviet Union and we could use it to screw with the Soviet Union. But Pakistan loved us because we could help them with India. And it may be surprising to those here in the 21st century, but throughout the Cold War, India would be very vocally say, we are not enemies of the United States. We are not enemy. We are non-aligned. We are with nobody. But the way that the United States interpreted that is like, you are a bunch of commie pricks.
Oh.
So we were on Pakistan's side, no matter what Pakistan was doing. When Pakistan was carrying out a genocide in the 70s in what became Bangladesh, we were on Pakistan's side. That has been the case, was beginning to fall apart even as early as the 1990s because we were more interested in cultivating India against China, even in the 1990s. But then with the war on terror, it came rampaging back. But we're not just talking about Pakistan here. We're talking about the Pakistan-Saudi relationship. So we're not going to get to, we don't want to get to 9/11 until, at least 40 minutes in here. So there was just this natural affinity from the beginning. Pakistan has this incredibly overdeveloped military, incredibly powerful. Saudi Arabia has no military.
Yes.
I say that very glibly. Saudi Arabia has one of the most expensive militaries on the planet. Saudi Arabia has more fighter jets than most, more tanks than most, it probably even has a navy, hilariously enough. But it famously does not have a competent officer corps because the Saudi royal family does not want it to have.
It feels like they're the absolute opposite of every other army because it tends to be like, oh, we have a certain number of people. Oh, we have to nickel and dime. And oh, can you move that plant here? Can we make it? While the Saudis just look at the catalog and go, all of the most expensive things. Oh, do you not need anything else? No.
Yeah, so Saudi Arabia's military is about buying admission tickets to the U.S. Defense establishment. Pakistan is about fighting wars with India, and I can't judge, but many argue that in their most recent, very frightening military engagement with India, a country much larger than they are, Pakistan did pretty well. So Pakistan has a real military. Saudi Arabia has like a very expensive series of bribes.
But also Pakistan has, obviously when you compare everyone to India, they don't seem like they have enough people, but Pakistan has a large amount of people while Saudi Arabia is 20 million?
Saudi Arabia, I think, is maybe up to 35.
Okay.
And
but Pakistan can just give you a load of men and has a lot of, understanding of the very basics of military operations.
Exactly. And that's my point, is that they complement each other. Saudi Arabia does not have a military. Pakistan has a military. Pakistan does not have money.
Yes.
It is a famously poor country, horrifically poor country, outside of some very privileged elites. Saudi Arabia has a ton of money.
Would Pakistan just have better brains? They seem like a much smarter people than the Saudis.
Well, I think that's getting a little eugenics.
No, I didn't mean it like that, but it feels like just to come up with a nuclear program. I know there seems to be a lot of the Saudis have funded that, but to come up with that in Pakistan's situation is kind of outstanding. understanding.
100 years ago, like Saudi Arabia's population was, I mean, I think, it was under 1 million, I believe. Pakistan has cities that are ancient seats of learning, that are, massive population. So I wouldn't want to say something like, oh, they're smarter than each other, but like historically, Saudi Arabia is like a bunch of, and I don't think they'd consider this insulting, like a bunch of folks who were, Bedouin chieftains, essentially, with a really rich culture there, but not a ton of Mecca and Medina, which they try to claim the legacy of, like those were run by completely different classes of people. Like Saudi Arabia more broadly is not a, historically, I'm sure they're now mostly literate or what have you, but that was not the case 100 years ago. Pakistan has population centers, cities, learning and sophistication going back millennia. Yeah, certainly a distinction. Pakistan is just more of a real country, frankly, even though it's sort of, as we've pointed out before, it's kind of set up for failure. The founders of Pakistan intended Pakistan to have Kashmir and other populations. Bangladesh was part of Pakistan before the Pakistani leadership screwed it up. This is all a long way of saying that these are very complementary countries, and I did not look up to see whether they have the same specific school of Sunni Islam, but they are both Sunni Islamic countries. And for the entirety of the Cold War era up until today, Pakistan is getting a little wonkier with that. They have been getting closer to China over the past 10, 15 years, for sure. They have had Sunni Islam in common. They have had a lot of enemies in common, and they have had their main number one supremo big deal patron in common, which is the United States of America. And the idea that there is some kind of like undermining of U.S. empire or like some kind of move towards the BRICS, the new BRICS multipolarity era by like two of our most deeply entwined client states, maybe getting slightly more entwined is a deep absurdity to me. So these affinities were always the case from 1947, I think it was, or no, FDR was dead by then. I don't know, FDR had a famous meeting with Ibn Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia in the 1940s, I believe during World War II, I suppose. Saudi Arabia has been very firmly in the U.S. camp ever since then. Shortly after 1947, the independence of Pakistan, it became Pakistan became a close U.S. ally. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have been eager to work with each other, I think, from the beginnings of, from the 1940s. What that actually meant, because frankly, Saudi Arabia just didn't have that much state capacity or the ability to steer its wealth that it later acquired. This process accelerated through the 1950s and the 1960s. And then in the 1970s, it went into overdrive. This is the relationship, Rory, that I would say brought us 9/11.
Oh, wow.
So, big success. But others would claim that this is the reason why this relationship is the reason why we defeated the Soviet Union. I would argue it has a hell of a lot more to do with oil prices and the Federal Reserve.
Apparently, the Saudis gave as much money to the Mujahideen and stuff as America did through sort of Pakistan.
Oh no, dramatically more.
Oh, really?
Dramatically
Wow.
more. Oh, dramatically more. Well, that's the beauty of Saudi Arabia is that it's easy for people to undermine, when I make the point that Saddam Hussein was like the US's guy. We did the Iran-Iraq war to Iran. They took some hostages, then we killed 1 million people. We killed 1 million Iranians, and what are you—
destroyed their navy?
And they're like, what are you talking about? We only gave them $150 million worth of helicopters. Yeah, we only gave them $150 million of helicopters for the Iran-Iraq war, and Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states gave Saddam Hussein $32 billion to kill Iranians. And Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states do not exist outside of the context of U.S. support. That's just so, but what I'm saying is that's the same, that's the deniability. The Saudis, one of the reasons why they were able to get away with 9/11 is because the Saudis had done such great work for us throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s. bankrolling every nasty thing we wanted to do. So yes, by the end of the fight against the Mujahideen, we might have been sending hundreds of millions of dollars a year to the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. The Saudis, I believe, I could be wrong about this. I know I'm right about the Iran-Iraq War example, but my expectation is that the Saudis were spending vastly more than the United States was. But I think a lot of U.S. funding was filtered through Pakistan.
Okay.
Because we were leery, outside of the CIA, we were leery of putting big sums of money towards, directly to the Mujahideen, even back then. But the Pakistani military, which we were heavily, heavily supporting at the time, was freer with that. And that is, of course, how we have the Pakistani intelligence services, the ISI, working closely with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda as, a thing that happened. But there's a lot of things that happened in the 1970s that made Pakistan and Saudi Arabia much more valuable to each other. I go back and forth on this. I have maintained in the past, and I 100% agree, 100% continue to maintain, that Saudi Arabia carried out a sort of cultural genocide against worldwide Islam between the 1950s and really MBS. MBS has done a lot more to dial this back than I expected. But certainly from the 1960s, possibly earlier, the Saudis worked very, very hard to impose their radical version of Islam against across the world. And, in 1950, Islam was a tremendously diverse religion. Yes, I mean, I'm sure that in many places their attitude towards women and other aspects were more fervent or conservative than we would like. That also describes Christianity in the 1950s.
Yes, definitely.
And the Saudis came in with their U.S. and other U.S., European, and Japanese oil money and came into a lot of very poor countries with much more interestingly diverse Islamic cultures and forced them into the insane Wahhabi mindset that gave us Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And that was like a horrific thing. And what's interesting about Pakistan is I kind of see that as an exception because the Pakistanis, and this is what I go back and forth on, like, are the Pakistanis an exception to this or not? Whereas most other countries that have jihadis, I'm like, yep, that's Saudi Arabia's fault. Like, that is the violent religious extremists in every Muslim country are, if you look at it, like, they spent a ton of time going to school, and they often like either went to school in Saudi Arabia themselves or were educated by people who did. They learned their poison in a Saudi-funded mosque. Pakistan actually kind of has its own religious extremism, which comes out of losing to India so much, which comes out of
like a genuine fear.
Genuine fear, and like it is homegrown. There are versions of, like, I believe there are Pakistani radical Islamic terrorists that aren't Wahhabi.
Okay, yeah.
Like, like that don't come out of the Saudi school of radical Islamic terrorism. However, I do, honestly, researching this morning, I kind of like went back and forth on that a little bit because Pakistan, again, is an incredibly poor country. I was looking into it, and like the religious schools, like this was off of Wikipedia, but it was something ridiculous. Like, thanks to Saudi money, like they went from having like 500 religious schools to having like 26,000 religious schools. It's just like, or maybe even 260,000. I don't know. So it's like, so yes, I think Pakistan came by its Islamic extremism a little more honestly. That, I can't blame it as exclusively on Saudi Arabia as I can blame it on Saudi Arabia for everybody else. But I don't know, just the more I read about Pakistan, the more complicated that gets. So the oil crises made Saudi Arabia incredibly rich, the one at the beginning of the 70s, the one at the end of the 70s. But Saudi Arabia felt incredibly threatened by the Iranian Revolution that brought about that second oil crisis. The Pakistani humiliation of the 1970s came at the very beginning. There used to be an East Pakistan. That country is now called Bangladesh. Pakistan waged a genocidal war against what became Bangladesh, and the Indians came in and trounced them. I was looking for support this morning, and I didn't find it, but I think it stands to reason that losing Bangladesh to, they would argue, to India, the way that they did sponsored a turn towards Islamic extremism. This is certainly how it worked in the Arab world, where losses to Israel in 1967 and 1970, I always forget, it was 72 or 73, led to a turn towards extremism because the old secular nationalism had been entirely discredited by these losses to Israel. So it stands to reason. I didn't find anything that made that direct connection, but that is certainly what happened in Pakistan. Zia-ul-Haq overthrew the prime minister, or was it president? Pakistan is one of those confusing countries that has gone from presidential to prime minister serial systems and back again. And I believe they still have both, but the president is back to being meaningless again after 2010. I don't know. But whoever, there was a more democratically legitimate government that Zia-ul-Haq turfed out in 1977. And at that point, even before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Zia-ul-Haq chose to push Pakistan in a much more Islamic direction. He's sort of credited or infamous for building the more radically Islamic country that Pakistan is today. And he certainly, even before the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets, had serious money supporting him in that from the Saudis. So these affinities, this complementarity of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan became much, much more important in the 1970s. They got driven much closer together because of the threats that Saudi Arabia was feeling from Iran, due to which it created this massive Iraqi military machine that then started threatening Saudi Arabia again as well. And Pakistan losing Bangladesh, losing, a series of, as it had lost a series of conflicts to India over Kashmir. So both of them felt very insecure. And I do think I'm definitely getting to a point where I am beginning to minimize the Cold War. I'm beginning to believe that that is kind of oversold. I think that the U.S. kind of won in 1956 and then kind of prolonged it by supporting every crappy British and French imperial war. And if we hadn't basically given the communists a bunch of good guys to ally with worldwide, it would have been over much more quickly. However, that should not underestimate the geopolitical shock, true tectonic shift of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. That was a really big deal. The Soviet Union, it seems strange considering how they collapsed just a decade later, but because of the oil crises and because the Soviet Union was a major oil and gas exporter, keep in mind that not only Russia, which is a major oil and gas exporter today, they had also Azerbaijan was part of the Soviet Union. Kazakhstan was a part of the Soviet Union. I think all three of those countries are in the top 20.
They're all big petrol producers.
Yeah, in the top 20 petroleum producers. So the Soviet Union did incredibly well in the 1970s, and they decided to do something they really hadn't done since Korea in the 1950s, which was actually try to expand the ambit of worldwide communism by military force with their invasion of Afghanistan. Afghanistan at that time was on the Soviet border because the Central Asian countries, which I've been instructed to no longer call the stands, were all part of the Soviet Union. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan were all part of the Soviet Union. Afghanistan was on the Soviet border. And one of my favorite comic books of all time, a 1986 Watchmen comic book that was talking about the possibility of World War III. And one of their scenarios that seemed very credible in 1986 was the Soviets have moved on from Afghanistan into Pakistan.
Okay.
So Pakistan not only felt a threat from India, Pakistan felt a very real-looking threat. We now know that perhaps there wasn't much to credit about it, but they were feeling very seriously threatened by the Soviet Union.
Oh yeah, at the time it was a very real threat.
And the Soviet Union was an enthusiastically atheist country, which is why perhaps the United States, certainly why the United States felt more of an affinity for Pakistan or Saudi Arabia than we might today, because they were religious and we were religious, and the Soviet Union was godless, which allowed us to provide a lot more support to Al-Qaeda types than we probably should have.
Apparently, that's the only reason American money says "In God We Trust."
Yeah.
It's only been on it since the 50s.
It's an Eisenhower thing, I believe. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. We'd warped ourselves in a lot of ways to fight the Cold War. Some of them useful, some of them not.
Would you say Saudi Arabia is a not?
I'd say Saudi Arabia is a not. This is also that sort of threat profile. The rise of Iran and the Soviet Union moving into Afghanistan is why CENTCOM exists. Familiar with
Yes,
the
it's
Central
sort of America
U.S. Central
running the
Command?
Middle East, essentially their military advisor or command for that region. But
It's our viceroys, essentially. Yeah, like our sort of military viceroys. It is currently estimated, it's intentionally vague, and the Pentagon never passes any
Judgment.
audits. Every part of the government needs to get audited, except for the Pentagon that keeps failing them, and nothing with no consequences. But the estimate is that CENTCOM costs us $50 to $60 billion a year, and $6 trillion of the $35 trillion U.S. national debt is exclusively related to CENTCOM, to stupid wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq.
So I'm sure Trump's going to be cutting that because he's trying to, pay off the debt.
Wouldn't it be nice? Right. Wouldn't it be nice? I think, interestingly, I can't remember. I think Israel for years was not under CENTCOM. They were actually under the sort of Europe one.
Oh, because they're European, because they're in
Yeah,
Eurovision.
exactly. I mean, that's how the U.S. military makes their decisions, based on Eurovision, right? And I think they were finally switched to CENTCOM, because it's now clear that after our failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that most of our destruction of the Middle East will be functioning through Israel now. So Israel recently added to CENTCOM, or maybe it's in the past 20 years added to CENTCOM. But yeah, like the whole justification for CENTCOM, people are like, oh, it's a Cold War. That's why we have these troops in the Middle East. No, like it was it was a Cold War, but it was the very end of the Cold War. It was Iran Revolution and Soviet-Afghan invasion is sort of the start of CENTCOM, which is, I think, one of the greatest curses on the American Republic we've ever seen. CENTCOM. And
Israel was added to CENTCOM in 2021.
2021. So yeah,
Fairly recently.
So that is and amazing how that works, huh?
Yes.
Add them to CENTCOM, and then you know what? That sounds overly conspiratorial, but it is amazing that whenever you do one of these administrative changes in the U.S. military, like AFRICOM, founded in 2008. 2011, we ripped the economic heart out of Northern Africa and turned it into a horrific war zone by taking out Gaddafi in 2011. That's crazy. 2021, and then in 2023, we got October 7th. It's just, I'm not saying that adding Israel to CENTCOM produced October 7th, but at a certain point, you've got to notice these parallels.
Oh, thanks to the Abraham Accords, apparently.
Delightful. And of course, a lot of people argue that the timetable of the Israeli attack on Iran had a lot to do with the retirement of Michael Kurilla, who was seen as a particularly Israel-friendly general. So they wanted to get that war in before he retired this year. But anyway, the minutiae of CENTCOM. So I think that this talking about CENTCOM is worthwhile because it illustrates the absolute absurdity of talking about Saudi Arabia and Pakistan working together as some kind of like anti-US thing. Like, these are the guys. Like, these are the guys who paid to found CENTCOM. Like these are CENTCOM. Like, Pakistan's military, Saudis, whatever you want to call that government, are like pillars of CENTCOM. Like, does this make it marginally less likely that Saudi Arabia is going to sign an Abraham Accord with Israel? Who cares? It's like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan working closer together has always been about serving U.S. interests. And of course, creating 9/11, which also served CENTCOM's interests. I don't want to seem overly conspiratorial, but it's hard not to get overly conspiratorial when you talk about Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. So Zia-ul Haq is very charming depiction in Charlie Wilson's War. Have you seen this film?
No.
With Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts and Philip Seymour Hoffman playing really one of his most delightful roles among many delightful roles as a sort of angry CIA guy. Written by Aaron Sorkin. It's great, but it's fascinating that they would glorify Zia-ul Haq and our misbegotten misadventure in, like, this movie came out like at least 5 to 10 years after 9/11. And in the 1980s, we poured a ton of money into funding extremist radicals who destroyed the communist-leaning government of Afghanistan, turned it into a horrific hellhole, and I think most Afghans would agree on that characterization of Afghanistan being a horrific hellhole. It was so horrific in the 1990s that they opted for the Taliban, and most concede that the Taliban was a big improvement over the monsters that we had funded and created to kick the Soviets out. I think probably you can still justify kicking the Soviets out of Afghanistan. As I've said, I think Paul Volcker and the oil price had a lot more to do with the fall of the Soviet Union than what we did in Afghanistan. But honest people can disagree on that, and maybe you still think it was worth 9/11. If you believe that the overthrow of the Soviet Union required our relationship with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan in the 1980s, funding all those jihadists, then if you believe the fall of the Soviet Union required that, then you can still justify what we did in Afghanistan to create, 9/11. But like, I don't believe that. So I kind of see it as a misbegotten waste of time, despite the fact that Charlie Wilson's War is a great movie.
Okay. I'll have to check it
which
out.
sort of which explains. I do love Aaron Sorkin. I know his politics are irretrievably bad, but he's the guy who wrote The West Wing. Have you ever
Okay,
heard of
I've
The
heard
West
of
Wing?
it. I know it's sort of it makes the White House look a lot better than I think it currently is. We can agree.
Or that it ever was. Honestly, he's
Yeah. It's a sort of fantasy version.
Yeah, this fantasy version where like the Republicans are certainly a bunch of right-wing yahoos, but really their hearts are in the right place, and can't we all just get along? And it's very Clintonite or what have you. And it's when I moved to Washington D.C. in 2003, everybody my age would. This is before streaming, but The West Wing was in syndication, and you could watch it 2 hours a night after work on one of the TV stations. So people would just rocket through the whole West Wing in syndication.
I think it's currently available
or at least
on
that's what people.
Channel 4, so their online service. So if anyone's in the UK, they can get tucked into the West Wing.
Yeah, I think The West Wing is perhaps unfairly, perhaps fairly blamed for a lot of the pathologies of sort of democratic Gen Xers and elder millennials, and just how tone deaf, pro business they
Okay.
all are. But anyway, so I
Is it a bit
we're
like how
falling
a
off.
journalist got evangelized because of Watergate? Apparently, journalists were seen as kind of trashy, and it's not a job to be
Mhm.
respected. And then after that, they were seen as like, oh, these are the bastions of the most powerful people, and they'll make sure that they won't do anything wrong because they'll be keeping an eye on them. And it seems like
Oh, what an interesting. I never really thought about it that way, but that's possible.
Mhm.
Well, I think West Wing absolutely glamorized politics and Washington D.C., and that's why all the nerds like me who moved to Washington D.C. after college, loved that show. Martin Sheen, amusingly the star of Apocalypse Now,
Yes.
which is kind of funny. In Apocalypse Now, he's a very cynical, beaten down Vietnam fighter, soldier in Vietnam, and then just 10, 20 years later, he's the president of the United States on the West Wing. But anyway, we've talked way too much about the West Wing and Aaron Sorkin. So Saudi Arabia, Pakistan overthrow Afghanistan's government. It's surprisingly, Afghanistan's government, pro-communist government, which I think predated the invasion, or maybe, they might have pulled what we did in Vietnam and put in a different communist ruler that they liked better. But the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 1988 or 89, I think, and that government lasted until 1997, which is kind of crazy. But anyway, maybe it was a worthwhile thing. I don't know. I went to Uzbekistan, and I was like, man, it is very much an Islamic country, but it is very much a modern country. And I was like, wow, so this is what we prevented in Afghanistan, huh?
This
it's sort of
happening,
go us.
this more functioning country.
But you know what? I don't know. I think Afghanistan is a freer country than it would have been if it had been an Uzbekistani country, and achieving the diversity of throwing acid in women's faces, I suppose. We created Al Qaeda in Afghanistan through a lot of close work with the Pakistanis and the Saudis, and there are really good narratives of what happened here. Steve Cole's Ghost Wars is sort of the classic. Talks in depth about Zia ul-Haq, talks about Saudi relationship, tracks the rise of Osama bin Laden. But it's important to remember that that's just a fraction of what was actually happening. There were billions of dollars from Saudi Arabia, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars from the United States pouring into this and creating really what the situation we have in Afghanistan today. Interestingly, I think it was Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the United Arab Emirates were the only countries to recognize the Taliban before 9/11.
Okay.
The only ones in the world, which was kind of interesting. So that's like where the relationship was. Oh, and of course, I'm sorry, in 1982, because of the threats of the Iranian Revolution, Soviets, the CENTCOM gets founded, and in 1982, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan sign a protocol aiming at mutual defense. So this is literally something that happened 43 years ago, and so the idea that this new contract is something new and special is frankly quite ridiculous. Throughout, I think the 70s and 80s, you had mentioned earlier, there were 20,000 Pakistani troops on Saudi soil. The Saudi royal family has used Pakistani troops for, as sort of bodyguards and just as a military force for quite literally decades. This shifted when CENTCOM really stepped up for the, some call the first Gulf War, some call the second Gulf War in the early 1990s, when the United States decided to sort of turn Saddam Hussein into a full-on rogue, sort of create a prison camp out of Iraq. The Saudis hosted U.S. soldiers there, which my understanding has kind of displaced a lot of the traditional Pakistani military forces. So the Saudis were like, well, geez, we've got the Cadillac version. Why would we go with the same guys who are bringing us our tea, I guess, because that's another huge dynamic between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan is there are a lot of Pakistani laborers in Saudi Arabia. Fewer than there used to be, but it is still a huge dynamic between the countries. And in 2015, Saudi Arabia went to Pakistan and said, hey, you guys are going to help us with this war in Yemen, right? And Pakistan was like, no, thank you. That does not sound like something we want to do. And all credit to Pakistan because that was a really good thing to avoid.
Definitely.
The Saudis ended up filling the gap with Sudanese child soldiers.
Oh, God.
Which, of course, that funding helped to create the RSF in Sudan that is currently in year 3 of a horrific war against the Sudanese armed forces, who ain't that great either.
No, one horrendous conflict that I thought it would have ended by now, but still going.
Yeah, still going.
But we should focus on it instead of Israel. Isn't that what we should do?
Yes,
completely ignore what
absolutely.
Israel's doing and focus on this civil war
Exactly.
that nobody
Exactly.
really would have any control over it. It's not like you could just stop it like that.
Well, I mean, the UAE is funding the RSF pretty heavily, so we absolutely can tell them to stop it like that.
Oh yeah, put pressure on them.
So I think it is fair to say that Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, after the experienced a little more distance over the war on terror period, culminating with the Pakistani refusal to pile in on Yemen in 2015. It's also easy to imagine as Saudi Arabia fell out of love with Al-Qaeda, and Pakistan was hosting its leader, for a decade after 9/11, until somebody finally slipped his information to the United States government in SEAL Team 6 and Osama bin Laden was killed. I would imagine there was some tension over that. The ISI in Pakistan certainly put lives on the line, put money on the line in service of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. But it probably became pretty clear to those guys after a couple years that the United States was not going to last in Afghanistan and had no idea what it was doing and covered its bets and continued, hid Osama bin Laden, continued to have relations with the Taliban that we don't understand to this day. Interestingly, now that the Taliban controls the whole country, maybe Pakistan and the Taliban are having a bit of a falling out, but it's hard to penetrate those details. Nor did we do the requisite research to do so.
But you will be getting your airport back, Rob, so you must be excited about that.
Yes, yes, of course. Trump is going to retake the Bagram airport. It's extraordinary that he would say something like that. It's possible there may have actually been some negotiations that now, after he's trumpeted them, now seem likely to be fruitless between the United States and the Taliban over Bagram Air Force Base. It's the Trump administration. Who knows? Like maybe we will try to invade Afghanistan again.
If it's just for the airport, it's at least more plausible than completely changing the fabric of a country.
I think to invade Afghanistan, we would absolutely need Pakistan's help
Yeah.
or at least acquiescence, and it's hard to see why they would want to do that. China is becoming a bigger factor for Pakistan. So it's not to say that things aren't shifting in this region. Things have been shifting specifically with Pakistan's orientation. Pakistan will do its best to be as friendly as possible to China and the United States for as long as that is possible.
And Saudi Arabia.
That is for sure. Oh, and Saudi Arabia, certainly. That is for sure. If the United States wants to retake Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, I would expect that the Chinese would probably be able to exercise kind of a veto on that.
Because that's exactly what Trump said. It's like, we might need to invade China. And you're like, okay, just tell everybody what you're up to.
Yeah, no, it just doesn't. But I don't actually see taking Afghanistan is in any sane estimation of U.S. national interest. Though honestly, our entire relationship with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan is not, to my mind, in any sane estimation of the U.S. national interest. Maybe it was before 2012 when we were somewhat reliant on Middle East oil, but honestly, these relationships function to make the region less safe and more unstable. If you look at the 40 years before the foundation of CENTCOM and the 40 years after the foundation of CENTCOM, the ones after the foundation of CENTCOM are infinitely worse for the Middle East, and in the crassest, the most material terms, infinitely worse and more dangerous for getting oil out of the Middle East. CENTCOM has made everything worse. It would be amazing, frankly, Rory, if this deal between our two greatest tools in the CENTCOM region meant some kind of limitation of U.S. ambitions, but I'm afraid it simply doesn't.
So do you think that if Saudi Arabia needs it, that Pakistan will pop some nuclear missiles in a ship so that they can be nuclear armed whenever they need to be?
Absolutely not. This seems to have come out of not the text of any document, but apparently some Saudi diplomat, crucially. A Saudi diplomat apparently said, yes, well, obviously now Pakistan's nuclear umbrella extends to Saudi Arabia. And I'm just like, not in a million years, buddy.
Unless it's, I guess, Iran, since Iran is fairly nearby. It may get nuked on behalf of...
I would say absolutely not. Yeah, I don't. And the thing is that Saudi Arabia is now trying desperately to maintain peace with Iran. So yeah, the Pakistan would sort of defend Saudi Arabia from Israel. No. Would defend Saudi Arabia from Iraq. No. It just sort of, I mean, I don't know, maybe Pakistan would, but it's not a serious issue more broadly. I think the United States would still defend Saudi Arabia from Iraq or Yemen. Is this intended to make the Houthis think twice about, bombing Saudi Arabia again? Sure. Will it make them think twice? Meh. At most, this symbolizes this strategic mutual defense agreement signalizes a renewal, or like a formalizing of a renewal of one of the longest standing and most damaging partnerships in international politics. And it's a partnership that certainly, to the U.S.'s detriment, but has been in service of the United States the entire time. So I'm really grateful, actually, for the opportunity of this fake agreement and the silliness with which it has been received, because it gave me an excuse to just sort of dive in on this relationship and spend a morning trying to enrich my understanding of Pakistan, which is meager at best, but needs improving. Just, I guess, finally, like, there's nothing really to say about Saudi Arabia's political system. It is an absolute monarchy, which makes it a foul anachronism that is a blight and a shame on humanity that it still exists in the 21st century. Pakistan is a much more complicated, but even sadder story. I don't know, less sad because there's hope. There's hope
Yeah.
in Pakistan.
No, I'm just laughing because, like, I'm thinking of this Riyadh Comedy Festival. There was one of the comedians kind of vaguely hinted that the country wasn't the nicest in the world, and he got kicked off.
Yeah, no, I think yeah.
So I'm just listening to your statement, and I'm like, none of those comedians that are apparently the most edgiest in the world would say anything half as controversial or honest as what Rob has just said.
Well, I think Tim Dillon got disinvited for pointing out that Saudi Arabia is a bit of a slave state.
Yeah. But he was
yeah,
a bit
so,
like, yeah, the place is great and it's full of slaves. That's their culture. Like, he was trying to be like, I don't know, bootlicking, but too enthusiastically.
Yeah, that's not their culture. That's the culture that we've facilitated. Pakistan has struggled mightily to have a democracy and is falling further and further away from it. We had the military dictatorship of Zia-ul-Haq, 1977, 1988. We had Pervez Musharraf, I remember from the 9/11 era, from 1999 to 2008. And it did seem in the 2010s like we were getting, usually the candidate that had the most blessing of the military won, but it did seem like Pakistan was trending into a more legitimately, or at least a better facade of democracy. With recent elections and recent actions, that has just disappeared. Pakistan still has a president and a prime minister, but I don't even really know their names, and why would I bother? Because Asim Munir, the head of the Pakistani military, seems to be the most important figure. In the most recent conflict, we were sort of, Modi represents India, and Asim Munir represents Pakistan. And what an extraordinary failure for the Pakistani people, for the Pakistani national project, that yet another military dictator. They don't even have to bother. It's interesting. When Zia-ul-Haq took over, I believe he hung his democratically elected predecessor.
Wow.
When Musharraf, this was a fun detail. When Musharraf kicked out a guy who became prime minister again later, he fled to Saudi Arabia, I believe. So that's just an indication of just like how close the relationships between these countries have always been. And now with Asim Munir being in charge, like they're not even bothering. Like they're not even bothering to unseat the president and the prime minister because they're that insignificant and that little a bar to whatever the Pakistani military wants. And of course, Imran Khan, the last democratically elected, believe it was prime minister of Pakistan, is languishing in jail potentially for the rest of his life. So yeah, Pakistan is a sad story. And I got to say, getting closer with the absolute monarchy of Saudi Arabia and getting more funding from them is probably not going to improve that democratic story. That's probably my main takeaway from Pakistan and Saudi Arabia getting closer again.
So no new super alliance then that's going to take over the world and threaten NATO?
I'm afraid not.
Okay. Well, maybe there will be someday. Ciao, ciao. Catch you
I
next
hope
time.
not. That'd be bad for me, Rory. It might be better for my soul, but it would certainly be bad for me in material terms. So, American Empire forever.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.